Hello, beautiful community. The Ukraine aid bill passes, and I want to elevate us to 30,000 feet. Not drop us from there, but just do a little bit of analysis from that altitude. It's lovely to see you. I'm not as daily connected with you as I would like to be at the moment because of my health deterioration. But I am doing my best to be with you as often as I can. Just some simple takeaways first on taking the win. One, it's not compulsory to take the win and then go out and engage in a whole bunch of polarization online and call accounts named the Ricky 888-431 a Russian asset. But if you must do that, then that's life. Second, don't worry about taking the win, even if some big historical patterns feel like they're going against you. Politics isn't an either-or enterprise. Whether we're talking about protecting Ukraine or the climate crisis or whatever else, an inch here or there, a degree here or there matters. So don't worry about the big trends. A win's a win's a win, and it's okay to celebrate it. And then thirdly, you know, all the people who wrote well about politics historically have emphasized the idea that we don't know what meaning an event will have until it settles to some degree on the riverbed, until it gets absorbed by history to some extent. And we don't need to wait until that to celebrate. Now, big picture story here is that we are in a moment that is partly defined by US withdrawal from the world. Part of the reason this has felt so hard to squeeze stuff out of the US for Ukraine is that to some extent US involvement in Ukraine is against the current, right? It goes against the bigger pattern, and you're trying to get somebody to do something while they're walking backwards. That's normally easier to do if they're walking forwards or at least standing still. What should happen practically? Well, I think what you want to happen practically is for Europe to do much more to pick up the pieces from the US, and for Europe to do much more to pick up the pieces from Europe. That's to say, if Paris, Berlin, London aren't up to the kosh, then other European countries in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Northern Europe should understand that they may need to lead without other major European powers. You know my broken record principle that we are dealing not just in the case of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, but also in the Middle East and indeed all over, with a lack of strategy for an international order on the part of the West that I say is secondary to democratic incapacity at home. Now, I won't elaborate that view again, but you may have also heard that when I say that, I sometimes emphasize that there's nevertheless a room for maneuver. That's to say that incapacity isn't absolute, it's dynamic, it's pliant. And we should think of the situation as allowing us a sort of, let's be very caricatural now, a 20% gap for maneuver. And that's why it's not entirely practically silly to do what a lot of experts are doing now on social media, that is talking about willpower, European willpower. Now, of course, talking about willpower is not in any practical or logical way connected with the generation of willpower, but nevertheless, willpower in that 20% gap can make a difference. But taken literally and analytically, these comments are, in my view, flawed. In other words, we are not dealing with a crisis of willpower, we're dealing with a crisis of democratic incapacity. And even though that incapacity is to some degree flexible, right, its limits are flexible and it's dynamic, you still need to be realistic about the capacity of democracies in order to get out of them the maximum that you possibly can toward whatever we want to sustain, avoid losing, or create in the international order. A really banal thought: what's a win and what's a defeat for us here? You know that I take a hawkish position, and that's to say that if Ukraine loses Crimea and the Donbass area, a big percentage of eastern Ukraine, then that's a loss for us. And it's a win for a kind of Russia-Chinese semi-alliance, because they've managed to change borders in Europe by force. And that constitutes a threat to us altogether and a threat to NATO, but it also constitutes a sort of individual threats to particular countries, whether it be the Baltics or Taiwan. Let's talk about Article 5. You see how deliberately I'm taking this right out of Ukraine, because I think we've got to see this in the bigger picture. Let's say a few things about Article 5. We've talked about it. We've had a video on the main channel about it. But let me put it a little differently to how I've put it before. There are 4 possibilities around Article 5. Because the Russians might be thinking that an opportunity will arise for them to effectively challenge and invalidate Article 5. Or they might not be thinking that. And then if the Russians were to challenge it, it might be true that it would lapse, or it might be true that it won't and will be able to sustain it and react. So there are 4 possibilities. The Russians believe they can test Article 5, and if they do, it'll lapse. The Russians believe they can test Article 5, and if they do, it'll hold. The Russians believe they can't test Article 5, and if they do, it'll hold. The Russians believe they can't test Article 5, and if they do, it'll lapse. 4. Now, the one that I've emphasized is the one that you are going to be sort of least analytically, interpretively nourished around. That is what I think the Kremlin are thinking, what they're partly co-opted into. And that is a theory about inexorable Western decline mediated belief that a time may well come when challenging Article 5 could lead to it lapsing. And then my analysis of what might actually happen in practice also invites us toward pessimism rather than optimism. And these are 2 really good constructive base scenarios to work off. But my real analytical recommendation to you is around taking seriously that possibility, which is my analysis, that the Kremlin has a theory of victory running through a sort of teleology about Western decline. A lot of experts don't share that view, and I'll try to engage us more in the way these disagreements balance out. There is, of course, another possibility, and that is of a coordinated attempt in the future by the Russians and the Chinese to take Ukraine and Taiwan. I won't talk about that more, but I will in a few seconds recommend a really very healthy and somewhat straightforward but helpful video from Anders Bach-Nielsen about how to think of the Russo-Chinese semi-alliance, as I call it. And that'll be here. But first I want to say something about comments disappearing on YouTube. YouTube has recently announced that this is a bug they feel they're fixed, or they feel they're fixing. We're going to see what happens. I know that we've seen three things happening. Random comments disappearing for no reason we can possibly ascertain. Comments disappearing in a way that feels that's to do with their content. And that breaks into two possibilities. So one is that YouTube is disappearing particular comments because that's a kind of glitch. And the second version of this, which is this third possibility, is YouTube is disappearing comments and they kind of want that. So we're going to see how this pairs out, but I really want to acknowledge the experience. And one member of the beautiful community reached out to me to ask for an acknowledgement of this. I want to give that. I want to acknowledge those of you who feel that you've been writing stuff and stuff has been disappearing. It has worked on my end too. There have been certain images, but also certain words that I seem to have had some problems with. And I actually know in a couple of cases the problems have not been political. I have had a problem with talking about the K word, that's to say the Putin regime killing Ukrainians. And part of the reason I've had a problem with it, talking to other colleagues on this platform, is I actually think a big mental health push to clamp down on anything that could possibly take you in the direction of directly discussing terrible mental health outcomes. So I just wanted to bring you on board a little bit with this, acknowledge the experience of those of you who've been on the wrong end of it. Together we'll see if this improves. Anders' video is here. Thank you for being with me and take the win. Lots of love.